From the Department of You Can't Make This Shit Up, the President of the United States defended neo-Nazis and white supremacists in a press conference that was supposed to be about infrastructure. Let's be clear, former KKK leader David Duke loved this press conference. That tells you pretty much all you need to know. But there was actually so much insanity packed into 16 minutes that we want to go back and analyze it all. So let's start about 8 minutes in, when it really started going off the rails.
Why did you wait so long until last week?
I didn't wait long. I didn't wait long. I didn't wait long.
First of all, let's get this part straight. About 2 hours after Heather Heyer was killed in a car attack in Charlottesville, Trump held a short press conference where he blamed the violence on many sides. People immediately pounced on him for not singling out the white supremacist groups that organized the rally. In fact, neo-Nazi groups ate up his statement, praising him for not singling them out and saying the violence came from many sides. It wasn't until 2 days later that Trump specifically denounced neo-Nazis and the KKK. But he says he didn't wait long.
If you go back to in fact, I brought it.
Who did you bring, Mr. President?
This press conference at Trump Tower was supposed to be about infrastructure. White House aides later said that they were surprised at the president going so off script. But he brought his original statement with him, so clearly he was steeled for a fight with the press.
As I said on, remember this, Saturday, we condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence. It has no place in America. And then I went on from there. Now, here's the thing. Excuse me. Take it nice and easy. Here's the thing. When I make a statement, I like to be correct. I want the facts. This event just happened. In fact, a lot of the event didn't even happen yet as we were speaking. This event just happened. Before I make a statement, I need the facts. So I don't want to rush into a statement.
We're already at our first major lie. I can point to at least 5 times off the top of my head when Trump made a statement before he had all the facts that he or other officials had to later retract or correct. A lot of the time, it involves Muslims or brown people being involved in alleged terror attacks. When someone was attacked at the Louvre in Paris with a knife, Trump tweeted almost immediately that it was radical Islamic terrorism. He's done that with car attacks elsewhere in France and London as well. By the way, he still has not called the Charlottesville car attack terrorism a full 5 days later, even though his own attorney general has.
So making the statement when I made it was excellent. In fact, the young woman, who I hear is a fantastic young woman, and it was on NBC, her mother wrote me and said through, I guess, Twitter, social media, the nicest things, and I very much appreciated that.
So while he's using Heather Heyer's mom here as a shield to deflect criticism, what we learned later in the presser is that he hasn't actually called her yet. He hasn't spoken to her. That's a pretty simple, customary tradition for sitting presidents to call the family members of victims after a terror attack or national tragedy. Let's fast forward this part of it.
CEO of Walmart said he missed a critical opportunity to help bring the country together.
Not at all. I think the country, look, you take a look. I've created over 1 million jobs since I'm president.
Switching gears here a little, it is true that just a little over 1 million jobs have been created in the U.S. economy since Trump took office. But that is not because of Trump. A former chief economist for the Department of Labor says employment has been steadily increasing since at least 2013, and that over the same time period last year, under President Obama, 1.2 million jobs were created. But there's a real level of hypocrisy here, because Trump's numbers are coming from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, whose numbers he called fake when they made Obama look good. But now he's using them to make himself look good.
I didn't know David Duke was there. I wanted to see the facts. And the facts, as they started coming out, were very well stated. In fact, everybody said his statement was beautiful.
Now we're apparently switching to third person. It doesn't make his statements any more accurate. Many people said Trump's many-side statement on Saturday was disheartening and confusing. His own vice president and other fellow Republicans condemned white supremacists outright, and many of them called on Trump to do the same.
Two questions. Was this terrorism? And can you tell us how you're feeling about your chief strategist?
Well, I
Steve
think
Bannon?
the driver of the car is a disgrace to himself, his family, and this country. And that is, you can call it terrorism, you can call it murder, you can call it whatever you want.
So he says you can call it terrorism, but he's still not going to outright say that he believes the Charlottesville car attack was terrorism himself, despite the fact that he's done it several times when the alleged attacker is Muslim or has brown skin. His own Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, went on ABC the Monday after the car attack and said it met the legal definition of domestic terrorism. The next day, Jeff Sessions' own boss still won't quite go there. Let's break this down. We know that Trump loves saying radical
Islamic terrorism,
even when we don't have all the facts of an attack. After a terror attack in London this June, Trump immediately called for a travel ban against people from majority Muslim countries. But he struggles to call a deadly attack by a white supremacist terrorism. That is what we call a dog whistle. Let's go to Merriam-Webster, one of the greatest Twitter trolls of the Trump era. They define a dog whistle as a coded message communicated through words or phrases commonly understood by a particular group of people, but not by others. When Trump calls out radical Islamic terrorism directly, but not radical white nationalist terrorism, he's signaling that he thinks one is worse than the other. And the neo-Nazis are hearing that. They're praising him on their own forums and their websites. So again, when it's a brown person, it's terrorism. When it's a white person, Trump says, is it terrorism? You can call it terrorism. And he does this all the time.
Can you tell us how you're feeling about your chief strategist, Mr. Bannon? Can you talk about that?
I would echo Maggie's question. Steve Bannon has come
I never spoke to Mr. Bannon about it.
Can you tell us broadly what do you still have confidence
Well,
in
we'll
Steve?
see. And look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that. And I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that.
Let's talk about Steve Bannon for just a second. Bannon himself has said he built his old website, Breitbart, to be a platform for the alt-right. Breitbart has a whole section for stories related to, and I quote, black crime. A whole section. There's no such one for white crime. But sure, he's not racist. Let's move ahead to the next question.
But when you say the alt-right, define alt-right to me. You define it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying,
define it for me. Come on, let's go. Define
Senator
it for me.
McCain defined them as the same group.
Okay, what about the alt-left that came charging at, excuse me, what about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
This is Senator McCain.
I'm sorry, you thought this press conference was crazy already? We're just getting to the craziest part. Trump is accusing counter-protesters, who he's calling the alt-left here, of instigating violence at the rally. We've seen the footage. We've seen the images. We know the white supremacists came armed and ready to fight. But the President of the United States is blaming the counter-protesters who came to stand up to bigotry and racism. Here's an eyewitness report from a BuzzFeed News reporter named Blake Montgomery. He says, most white supremacists and Nazi groups arrived armed like a paramilitary force, carrying shields, protective gear, rods, and yes, lots of guns, utilizing Virginia's loose firearm laws. They used militarized defensive maneuvers, shouting commands at one another to move forward or retreat. It's like they watched 300 a few times to gain ground or shepherd someone through projectiles. He says it seemed that they had practiced for this. They came ready to fight. And also, for the record, alt-left is a term straight from Sean Hannity's mouth. And we all know how much Trump loves Sean Hannity.
Let me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do.
It is true that members of anti-fascist groups have been violent at other protests in the past. But there is video footage from Charlottesville showing them standing around peacefully until white supremacist groups came charging at them. And people who were there said anti-fascist groups saved their lives by protecting them when things got violent. It's also worth noting that while there's a problem with some violent Antifa members that we need to discuss, none of the violence has yet resulted in someone dying. But Heather Heyer died because of white supremacist violence.
So, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day. Wait a minute, I'm not finished. I'm not finished, fake news. That was a horrible day. I will tell you something. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have, you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now. You had a group on the other side that came charging in without a permit, and they were very, very violent.
Without a permit. He may be talking about other groups here, but peaceful counter-protesters had at least 2 permits to organize in parks nearby the white supremacist rally, according to local news. But Trump is trying to say one side is more legitimate because they had a permit. He's completely ignoring what the huge moral question is here, which is that you shouldn't defend neo-Nazis in any case. That should be easy. And he gets another opportunity to clear this up, but he doesn't.
Go ahead. Do you think that what you call the alt-left is the same as neo-Nazis?
Those people, all of those people, excuse me, I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch.
Let's just cut to the tape here.
Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee. So, excuse me, and you take a look at some of the groups and you see, and you know it if you were honest reporters, which in many cases you're not, but many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
So Trump is now equating people who fought to break up the Union with people who fought to create the Union. Those are not the same thing. There are many Republican governors and officials who have called to take down Confederate statues, but Trump is staking out a unique position here in that he apparently has no position. Do you know who did have a position on Confederate monuments? Robert E. Lee himself. In 1869, he was invited to a Civil War commemoration that would include putting physical markers on the battlefield of Gettysburg. And this is what he wrote. I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered. So the Confederate leader himself basically said, let's forget about it, let's move on. But 148 years later, our current president cannot bring himself to say the same. Trump is keeping open the sores of war, but for what purpose?
Should statues of Robert E. Lee stay up?
I would say that's up to a local town, community, or the federal government, depending on where it is located.
Are you against the Confederacy?
1, he didn't answer that question. And 2, I think a better question would have been, can you actually explain what the Confederacy stood for? Because at this point, after equating Confederate generals to the Founding Fathers, I'm not sure he can. His answers here are remarkable because GOP state leaders in the South are pushing to abandon these monuments, but Trump refuses to take a position.
How concerned are you about race relations in America, and do you think things have gotten worse or better since he took office?
I think they've gotten better or the same. Look, they've been frayed for a long time, and you can ask President Obama about that because he'd make speeches about it. But I believe that the fact that I've brought in, it will be soon, millions of jobs. You see where companies are moving back into our country. What people want now, they want jobs. They want great jobs with good pay. And when they have that, you watch how race relations will be. And I'll tell you, we're spending a lot of money on the inner cities.
Couple things here. We've seen this trope before. A reporter asks about race relations, and Trump starts automatically talking about inner cities, as if that's the only place in America where black people live. He also said things have gotten better or been the same with race relations since he took office, which is patently untrue. The number of hate groups are on the rise. Over 700 hate crimes were reported in the months after the election, many directed at Jewish people, at black people, and at brown immigrants. And in a very sad turn of events, the Southern Poverty Law Center says many hate crimes often invoke President Trump's name.
Mr. President, are you putting what you're calling the alt-left and white supremacists on the same moral plane?
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
In times of crisis, the President of the United States has an obligation to stake out positions on a moral plane. Trump is completely abdicating his duty here in a way that we have not seen in lifetimes.
On both sides, sir, you said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me, they didn't put themselves down as neo, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
At this point, Trump has repeatedly condemned what he calls leftist protesters for being violent, and he is defending the white supremacists who organize these rallies. He has not said that they were responsible for starting any of the violence, despite the fact that they were heavily armed and despite the fact that the woman who was killed was a counter-protester. This is what we call a false equivalence. He's saying both sides are the same, both sides are to blame, when one side is actually morally wrong and should be condemned by all political leaders, and has been condemned by most political leaders except for President Trump. He's all saying that there are very fine people in the group of white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Just take a second and process that. Very fine people marching at this rally. He's literally defending them at this point, even though their agenda was very clear, as evidenced by their own chants. This is exactly why people like David Duke and Richard Spencer were crowing with excitement while watching this press conference, because the President of the United States is completely letting them off the hook. The both sides talk is also a throwback to the 1950s, when, according to historian Kevin Cruz, politicians who favored segregation would equate the NAACP and the KKK. One group called for the elimination of black people. The other called for equal rights for black people. And we're seeing the same thing today, with Trump equating white supremacists with the people who were counter-protesting them.
Well, no, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture.
This is such an important part. This is perhaps the most important part. Trump says here, you're changing history, you're changing culture, which is exactly what the white supremacists are protesting. This is what Van Jones called white lash after the election. We are seeing scared white people lash out with anger, discrimination, hatred, and violence because the demographics of our country are changing. But it's not about changing history. We're merely acknowledging the racist history of our country when we look at what Confederate generals fought for, slavery, and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't literally put them on a pedestal. Trump is trying to defend the Charlottesville rally organizers by saying they're not all bad. Some of them are just sad about changing history and changing culture. But their inability to accept black and brown people as equal is what is considered changing culture to them. And that is the definition of a belief in white supremacy.
So I only tell you this, there are two sides to a story.
President, have you spoken to the family? Have you spoken to the family of the victim of the car attack?
No, I'll be reaching out. I'll be reaching out.
When will you be reaching out?
I thought that the statement put out, the mother's statement, I thought was a beautiful statement. Thank you.
Do you plan to go to Charlottesville, Mr. President?
I own a house in Charlottesville.
Will you go to?
Does anyone know I own a house in Charlottesville?
Where is it?
Oh boy, it's going to be. It's in Charlottesville. You'll see.
Is it near the winery or something?
It is the winery.
Will you go visit and try to?
I mean, I know a lot about Charlottesville. Charlottesville is a great place that's been very badly hurt over the last couple of days. But I own actually one of the largest wineries in the United States. It's in Charlottesville.
So that sums it up. As Kylie Crow said on Twitter, he defended racists, promoted his winery in Charlottesville, and left, which is a pretty good summation of the entire Trump presidency so far. This was a brutal press conference where he went from using dog whistles to outright defending white people who think preserving their culture means demeaning other races. There are not two sides to this story. One side is very open and clear about their hatred of Jews, of black people, and others. Trump has since been roundly condemned by people from all parties and political affiliations for this press conference. He seems to care more about having a permit than the moral crisis of saying one race is superior to another in America. And he's even wrong on that point. Let's not beat around the Billy Bush. These false equivalencies and both sides talk are Fox News talking points, ingrained in a man who's been watching the network for years now, and who we now know watches it almost every day. I've often said that Fox News has poisoned the minds of millions of Americans, but now one of them sits in the White House. The only thing left to say is something we heard a lot during the election. When someone shows you who they are, over and over and over again, believe them.